Have you ever walked into a room where the tension was so sharp you could almost feel it against your skin? That was the atmosphere inside a vast Washington auditorium on a humid evening, as rows of citizens, journalists, and policy experts filled every seat beneath the bright, unrelenting glow of ceiling lights. American flags framed the stage, banners proclaimed messages of bipartisan renewal, and cameras stood like watchful sentinels, ready to beam each word across the country. This wasn't just another town hall. It was billed as a forum that could shape the conversation about America's economic future, and the crowd knew it. The anticipation was heavy, humming like an electrical current, as if everyone sensed a storm of ideas was about to break. Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana stepped onto the stage first, his confident but relaxed stride embodying the calm of someone who had weathered many political tempests. He carried the air of a Southern storyteller, dressed sharply, but speaking with the ease of someone who could turn complicated fiscal concepts into a neighborly chat. Facing him from across the stage was Congresswoman Maxine, her presence commanding, her eyes focused with the intensity of a fighter who had spent decades battling for equity and justice. The contrast was vivid, his slow, measured drawl against her fiery urgency, his reserved calm against her unapologetic conviction. As the moderator, a seasoned journalist, outlined the evening's rules: respectful dialogue, focus on facts, and commitment to solutions. The audience broke into polite applause. Yet beneath that civility lay an unmistakable charge, the sense that the two leaders seated at opposite ends of the stage represented not just different policies, but two competing visions of what America could and should be. Kennedy scanned the crowd thoughtfully, preparing to speak about fiscal responsibility, about how smart, disciplined spending could protect retirees, lift small businesses, and rebuild infrastructure without leaving crushing debt for the next generation. Waters held her pen tightly, ready to counter with calls for progressive reform, targeted relief for struggling families, and stronger regulations to correct systemic injustices. When Kennedy leaned toward the microphone and began in his slow Louisiana cadence, "Folks, let's talk straight about our economy, like we would at the kitchen table." The room leaned in. He painted pictures of oil rig workers and teachers, of families in small towns who knew the value of every dollar. He argued that debt rising unchecked would choke opportunity for future generations. His analogies made policy sound simple, like balancing a family checkbook, where waste meant fewer chances for the people who sacrificed the most. The audience nodded, some in agreement, some in scrutiny, as Kennedy's words blended data with plain-spoken wisdom. But when he shifted to criticizing sweeping social spending programs, warning they too often led to inflation that struck hardest at low-income households, the atmosphere sharpened. That's when Waters leaned forward, her voice sharp as steel. "Sit down." Her words cracked through the auditorium like thunder, silencing the murmur of the crowd. This wasn't a simple interruption, it was a challenge, a direct rebuke meant to seize the narrative. Waters accused Kennedy's calls for balance of being little more than code for leaving marginalized families behind. "We've tried your so-called prudence," she said with conviction. "All it's ever done is keep the rich richer, while kids in my district struggle to pay for college or basic health care." Reporters' fingers clattered across keyboards, headlines already forming, while cameras zoomed in on the tense standoff. All eyes turned to Kennedy, wondering if he would match her intensity or retreat into caution. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He let the silence breathe, adjusted his glasses, and took a measured sip of water before replying with a gentle smile. "Well, Mom," he said, the drawl deliberate and calm. If I sit down right now, who's going to explain how we lift everybody up without sinking the ship? The line landed like a spark in dry grass, humorous yet pointed, respectful yet firm. Laughter bubbled through the room, applause followed, and just like that, the tension loosened. Kennedy's reply acknowledged her concerns, but reframed the confrontation into collaboration. He reminded the audience that fairness mattered, but so did sustainability, that policies had to lift people up without bankrupting the future. His demeanor was steady, his wit disarming, and in that moment, he turned what could have been a viral clash into an example of composure and leadership. Waters didn't back down. Her eyes remained fiery as she pressed on, citing hard numbers about stagnant wages, discriminatory lending, and the rising wealth gap. She demanded answers on how Kennedy's fiscal restraint could possibly repair decades of systemic injustice. Kennedy responded not with defensiveness, but with stories about Louisiana towns that rebuilt after hurricanes not by endless federal spending, but through a mix of aid, accountability, and local innovation. He spoke of job training credits that gave people pathways to stability, of entrepreneurs who rose from poverty to success when regulation gave them room to grow. Waters countered fiercely, raising examples of deregulation that left communities vulnerable, but Kennedy answered with state-level data showing increases in minority entrepreneurship. The debate was sharp but layered, neither side surrendering their convictions, yet both exposing the audience to the full complexity of America's economic crossroads. As the evening stretched on, the clash deepened into a substantive exploration of values and visions. Waters's voice carried the urgency of someone who had seen families crushed by medical bills and students shut out of opportunity. She framed Kennedy's approach as cold arithmetic that failed to address the human cost of inequality. Kennedy, however, listened intently, his fingers steepled, his gaze steady. When he responded, his voice was patient, almost like a doctor breaking down a tough diagnosis in plain English. He conceded her points about inequality, but countered that throwing money at broken systems without reform risked compounding the problem. He told the story of a mechanic named Joe from rural Louisiana who rose out of poverty thanks to targeted job training credits. That man, Kennedy explained, now employed a dozen people and sent his kids to college. Proof that carefully designed policies could change lives without ballooning the deficit. The story landed with quiet power, turning data into human reality. Waters shot back that anecdotes were not enough to solve systemic barriers, citing discriminatory lending practices that persisted nationwide. Kennedy didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned into her critique, explaining how he had supported bills for fair lending audits and vocational partnerships in minority-owned businesses, blending enforcement with economic opportunity. It's not about choosing between justice and opportunity, he said. It's about building both. His ability to validate her concerns while weaving them into his broader framework impressed even skeptics. The audience began to sense that the debate wasn't just about policy differences. It was about two leaders modeling how to argue fiercely without dehumanizing one another. Reporters whispered about Kennedy's grace under pressure, tweeting that he had turned confrontation into collaboration. He expanded his arguments into healthcare, trade, education, even criminal justice, always circling back to the theme of balance. Spending smarter, not just bigger, and empowering people rather than fostering dependency. The dialogue grew richer, moving from sparring to serious problem-solving, with Kennedy's calm reason acting as the anchor that steadied the ship. By the final stretch, the debate reached its climax. Waters unleashed one last surge, her voice booming with passion as she accused Kennedy of blindness to suffering. She pointed to poverty wages, failing neighborhoods, and corporate greed as proof that restraint had only preserved inequality. The room held its breath, the silence thick, as the cameras captured every flicker of expression. Kennedy remained unshaken. He acknowledged her truths. That inequality was real, that suffering was undeniable, but he pivoted brilliantly. What if, he proposed, they worked together on bipartisan infrastructure, bills tied to job training, funded through partnerships that multiplied every dollar? What if her passion for justice could be paired with his focus on sustainability to create real solutions? It was an invitation, not a rebuttal, and the audience erupted in applause. Even Waters, momentarily surprised, softened, nodding in cautious agreement. Kennedy elaborated with examples from Louisiana, where similar models had revitalized communities post-disaster. It's not about winning an argument, he said gently. It's about winning for the American people. When the debate closed, Waters extended her hand, and Kennedy clasped it firmly, a gesture that captured the evening's transformation. Cameras flashed, social media lit up, and within minutes the clip was viral. Headlines praised his civility and poise, hashtags like Fake Kennedy Unites and Face Civil Debate trended, and ordinary Americans shared the handshake as a rare example of leadership grounded in respect. For many, Kennedy's performance was more than a political win, it was a lesson. True strength isn't measured by how loudly you shout, but by how deeply you listen, how gracefully you respond, and how bravely you search for common ground. In turning a sharp command to sit down into a call to stand together, Kennedy left the audience not only impressed but inspired, a reminder that unity is not a dream but a discipline, one that America desperately needs.